Welcome to this deep dive. We're going deep into child and adolescent psychiatry today.
Yeah.
And we've got excerpts from a textbook, some academic studies we'll be looking at,
Okay.
even some case studies, real-life case studies.
That's good.
But we're not just looking for medical facts.
Right.
We're trying to understand, like, how do the professionals, how do they approach
Right.
the world of young people and their development? It's so complex.
It is, and it goes so far beyond just giving a diagnosis.
Yeah.
I think we'll see that as we get into it.
Well, the textbook actually starts with this.
Oh, okay.
Interesting story.
Mhm.
It's about the impact of a psychiatrist's words.
Yeah.
Like, they were saying how parents, they remember what a psychiatrist said
Oh, wow.
about their child,
Okay.
even years later.
That's huge.
It really is.
It makes you realize how much weight a psychiatrist's words carry.
Yeah.
It's not just about,
Yeah.
here's the diagnosis. You've got to be so mindful of how you communicate that, especially if it's difficult news.
Oh, for sure.
And think about it. You're a parent.
Yeah.
You get that kind of news, it could totally change how you see your child's needs.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it makes you think about just how powerful language can be.
Right.
Think about a time when someone said something to you that just stuck with you,
Oh, yeah.
good or bad.
It happens.
It really does.
For sure. And this all goes way beyond the clinic, too.
Okay.
The textbook, there's a whole section on working with educators.
I was going to say, yeah, it talks about that.
Yeah.
I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, it is.
It's like understanding how a kid learns can completely change
Right.
how they do in the classroom.
For sure.
There's this one example about kids who struggle with handwriting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because they're lazy or anything.
Right.
It's that their brains,
Yeah.
they just process information differently, and that
Right. It affects them. Yeah.
affects their writing speed.
Yeah. It makes you wonder how often we judge people
Yeah.
based on their behavior without really knowing why they do what they do.
Oh, all the time, right?
Have you ever experienced that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like judging a fish for not climbing a tree.
Exactly.
Right, so you've got to look deeper.
Yeah.
Especially with kids,
Yeah.
things aren't always what they seem.
Right.
Speaking of looking deeper,
Okay.
the book goes into assessment tools
Mm-hmm.
from those IQ tests, the classic.
Yeah.
Some more unique methods.
So you've got the classic ones like the WISC, the intelligence tests.
Yeah.
But then there are these projective tests, like the children's apperception test.
Oh, yeah, the SIAT test.
Yeah.
That one, I was like, what?
Yeah, they show pictures of animals in different situations, and they have kids tell stories about what's going on in the picture.
Right.
It seems so simple, but
Yeah.
it's really insightful. Kids, they project their own stuff onto those animals,
Oh, wow.
Relationships, anxieties, needs.
Interesting.
They're expressing their inner world, but in this less direct way.
Yeah.
Which can be so helpful.
I bet. Yeah.
If a child struggles to, tell you how they feel.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like you're decoding their emotions through those stories.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah.
The book also talked about some high-tech stuff.
Oh, right.
PD scans and something called event-related potentials.
Those can be really useful, especially for kids who have trouble communicating.
Yeah.
Think about kids with autism.
Okay.
It can be hard to assess them.
Yeah.
But these techniques, they give us a glimpse into how their minds are working.
Right.
By actually measuring their brain activity.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So technology is helping us understand the brain
Absolutely.
in a way we couldn't before.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Now, when it comes to treating these challenges, the book really stresses a holistic view, looking at the whole child.
Right. It's not just about the diagnosis. It's about seeing the whole person.
Exactly.
And there's been a shift away from those long-term therapies like psychodynamic therapy toward more targeted approaches like CBT.
Oh, CBT.
Yeah.
It explains how CBT actually gives kids tools to manage their own thoughts and behaviors.
Exactly. They become their own therapist.
I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and you can't forget about family.
Right.
Right? It really digs into that.
Yeah.
Understanding the kid's whole world.
Their ecosystem, yeah.
There's even a case study where
Oh.
a mom, she was making assumptions about her son's behavior, but was actually making things worse. It wasn't on purpose or anything.
Right.
But it just highlights how important it is for everyone to be on the same page.
Absolutely.
Parents, educators, caregivers.
Collaboration is key.
To really support a kid's mental health.
Definitely.
So to get a better grasp of all these challenges,
Okay.
let's look at a few specific examples from the source material.
Sounds good. Where do you want to start?
Well, ADHD is something a lot of people have heard of. Most know the core symptoms.
Right.
Inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. But there's this research in the textbook that I found surprising.
What's that?
Did you know that treating ADHD effectively with stimulants can actually decrease the likelihood of substance abuse later on?
It seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does.
But it shows how important it is to address those underlying factors early on.
Right.
Like, we're not just managing behavior, we're looking at what's happening in the brain.
That's a good point, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, while we're talking about conditions that people don't always get, let's talk about eating disorders.
Yeah.
They're serious.
They are.
They can have devastating consequences. And there's this study that debunked a common misconception.
Oh.
It found that eating disorders, they're not limited to a certain socioeconomic class.
Right. They can affect anyone, regardless of their background.
Exactly. So we need to be aware of the signs across the board.
Sure.
Now, for our final example,
and
I know this can be a tough subject, let's touch on childhood trauma.
It is a heavy one, but it's so important to understand how long-lasting the impacts can be.
Right.
You know, the book really gets into how trauma, it can actually change the brain on a biological level.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it affects things like emotional regulation, stress response. It's not something you just get over.
Right. Exactly.
And that's why early intervention and support are so crucial.
Absolutely, for both the child and their caregivers.
Okay. Yeah. Now, before we move on, I think it's important to acknowledge that, diagnosis has its limitations. Right. And the textbook actually talks about this. Especially with gender identity disorder.
GID, yeah. It's a good example of how societal pressures can really shape how we view what's normal, and how quickly we label things as disorders.
Right.
It's a complex debate.
It is.
But I think it's crucial to be aware of these nuances.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've got to consider cultural context. Individual differences.
Right. It's not about putting everyone in the same box.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing that everyone's different.
Yeah.
Approaching assessment with sensitivity and an open mind.
Well said.
Thanks.
Okay. Speaking of which, the book has a whole chapter on advocating for the child, highlighting all the legal and ethical considerations in child psychiatry.
It's a huge part of the field.
Yeah, it's not just about diagnosis and treatment. It's about making sure the child's rights are protected.
Absolutely.
That they get the support they need.
Yeah, and it talks about the challenges of, like, balancing confidentiality with involving parents and authorities when needed.
Yeah, there's also a section on, like, the legal stuff around educational assessments.
Oh, right.
And special ed services, IEPs.
Yeah, that can be a real maze to navigate.
It is. Yeah. It's a whole other layer of complexity.
Definitely.
It's so important to understand.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
But there's so much more to explore.
There is.
We'll be back with more insights.
Okay.
In just a moment.
Sounds good. Welcome back.
All right, so now.
Let's dive into the world of babies and toddlers.
Okay.
It's amazing how much development happens.
I know.
At that age.
Right.
And it can be really hard to, figure out what's going on in those little minds.
Yeah. They can't exactly tell us what they're thinking or feeling.
Right.
But there's something going on.
You can tell. Yeah.
The book talks about understanding their way of communicating.
Exactly. They might not have words.
Right.
But their behavior, it speaks volumes.
Okay.
The textbook highlights this model.
Okay.
Developed by Daniel Stern and Nadia Bruchweiler-Stern. They're child psychiatrists.
Okay.
And it focuses on gathering information from different sources to understand the infant.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
So first, you have the parents' perspective.
Right. They're the ones who see them the most.
Exactly. They're usually the first to notice if something's up.
Makes sense.
But it's important to remember their observations are filtered through their own experiences.
Right. Their own lens.
Exactly. So it's not about dismissing what they say.
Right.
But understanding it's just one piece of the puzzle.
So we need more objective info too, right?
That's where direct observation comes in.
Okay.
Could be watching the infant interact with their parents, play with toys, respond to different things.
It's like we're baby whisperers.
Kind of, yeah.
Trying to figure out their secret language.
We're paying attention to all sorts of things.
Okay, like what?
emotional expressions, motor skills, how they regulate their attention, their arousal.
Okay.
Even things like eye contact or how they respond to touch.
It's all important.
It all gives us clues.
So it's about the whole picture.
Yeah, and then there's this third piece.
Okay.
Assessing the infant's subjective experience.
That one's a little tricky for me.
I know, right? How you assess what a baby's experiencing when they can't talk.
Exactly.
It relies a lot on inference, more than direct communication.
Okay.
We're looking at nonverbal cues, smiles, cries, body language, taking their developmental stage into account, trying to understand what their behavior might be telling us.
Like detective work.
It is.
And speaking of games,
the
book talks about play therapy.
Oh, I love play therapy.
I've always found that so fascinating.
Me too. It's like play is a child's natural language.
Yeah.
How they explore the world, figure things out.
Right. Process emotions.
Exactly.
But with play therapy, there's actually a purpose behind it.
Absolutely. It's not just about having fun, though that's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
In play therapy, kids can act out their fears, anxieties, conflicts, but in a safe way, symbolically.
Right.
It gives them a voice when they don't have the words.
It's like a window into their unconscious.
You could say that.
So what's the therapist doing during all of this?
Observing, listening, helping the child make sense of what they're doing.
Okay.
It's not about interpreting it for them.
Right.
But providing a space for them to express themselves freely.
So the therapist is like a guide.
Yeah.
Helping them understand themselves through play.
Exactly.
Now, the book also talks about the parent-therapist relationship.
Oh, that's crucial.
Which makes sense, especially with little ones.
Absolutely. Parents are such a big part of their lives.
Right.
The therapists, they need to build a strong bond with the parents.
Okay.
Make them feel supported.
Yeah.
Remember, it can be so hard for parents to ask for help for their child.
Yeah.
They might feel guilty, ashamed, even scared.
It's a vulnerable thing to do.
It is.
Admitting you need help with your child.
Right. So the therapist needs to approach it all with empathy, no judgment.
Totally. Okay, so now let's talk about a specific therapeutic approach.
Okay.
CBT, have you heard of that?
Cognitive behavioral therapy. Yeah, it's used a lot with adults.
Yeah.
But it can be so helpful for kids and teens, too.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, it's about understanding the link between our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The book really emphasizes that our thoughts, they're not always accurate. But that's something we can actually work on.
It's like those negative thoughts we all get.
Yeah.
Sometimes they just take over.
Exactly.
And make us feel worse.
CBT helps us notice those thought patterns.
Okay.
Challenge them and replace them with more helpful ones.
Like rewiring our brain.
They've got it.
For a more positive outlook.
Yeah, and this can be really good for kids and teens. Because they're still developing, you know.
Right, they're still learning about themselves.
Their self-awareness and coping skills aren't fully formed yet.
Okay, so CBT can help with that.
Yeah, the textbook has some interesting case studies.
Oh, do you have a favorite?
There's this one about a boy named Danny.
Okay.
He was having a lot of behavioral problems.
Like what?
Tantrums, refusing to listen.
Oh, I know those.
Right. It was really hard for his parents.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to do.
They were at their wits' end.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the therapist, she used a combination of play therapy and CBT.
Okay.
To help Danny and his mom understand what was going on.
Okay.
They used a toy horse
to
represent Danny.
Yeah.
And they acted out different situations.
Oh, wow.
It helped him recognize his feelings of anger and frustration.
So they were practicing different ways to deal with those emotions.
Exactly.
It's so smart.
It is. And the therapist also worked with his mom
Okay.
to help her see how her reactions were part of the problem.
Right. It's not about blaming her.
No, not at all.
But understanding that it goes both ways.
Right. It's a two-way street.
The child's behavior affects the parent, and the parent's behavior affects the child.
And it becomes this cycle.
Exactly.
And CBT helps break those negative cycles, create more positive interactions.
I like how CBT is so action-oriented.
Yeah.
It's not just talking about problems. It's about giving people tools to change things.
Exactly. It's empowering.
It's no wonder it's been successful for so many things.
Right.
Anxiety, depression, ADHD, even eating disorders.
It's versatile. It can be adapted to different situations.
Speaking of which,
yeah,
let's dive into those specific challenges we talked about earlier.
Okay, sounds good.
Starting with ADHD.
Okay.
You mentioned it's more than just a behavioral issue.
It is. You know, we see the inattention, the hyperactivity, the impulsivity.
Right.
But those are just behaviors.
Yeah.
ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder.
Right.
there are actual differences in the brain.
Wow, so it's not just about willpower.
No, not at all.
Or discipline.
There's a biological basis.
So that must change how we think about assessment and treatment.
Absolutely. The textbook stresses a comprehensive evaluation.
Okay.
It's not just about observing behavior. We're talking about a thorough history, interviews with parents and teachers, maybe even neuropsychological testing to really understand how the individual's brain is working.
So we're moving away from those old labels like hyperactive.
Right. It's not that simple.
Toward a more nuanced view
Exactly.
of the child's needs.
We want to see the whole picture.
And when it comes to treatment, it's not one size fits all either, right?
Right. Medication is often part of it.
Yeah.
But it usually involves a combination of things.
Like what?
Medication, behavioral therapy.
Okay.
The book goes into the pros and cons of different stimulants, the risks, the side effects.
I can imagine those decisions around medication are really tough for parents.
They can be, yeah.
That's why it's so important to have open communication with the doctor.
Right.
Parents need to feel comfortable asking questions, being informed about their options.
Now, let's talk about eating disorders.
Okay.
We said earlier how serious they are.
Yeah, they are.
But what makes them so hard to treat?
They're just so complex.
Yeah.
It's important to remember they're serious mental illnesses.
Right.
It's not just about vanity or wanting to be thin.
Okay.
There's usually a lot going on emotionally.
So you can't just tell someone to eat more or stop purging.
Exactly. It's not that simple.
Okay.
The book talks about the biological, psychological, and social factors that all contribute.
So we need to understand the individual's triggers.
Their vulnerabilities, yeah.
And with all that complexity, how do you even approach treatment?
It usually involves a team of professionals.
Okay.
Working together.
Like who?
Therapists, nutritionists, maybe even doctors prescribing medication.
So it's about addressing the eating disorder behaviors.
But also the underlying emotional issues.
Exactly.
Wow, it takes a village.
It often does.
To support someone through recovery.
And the earlier we catch it,
the
better the chances of a full recovery.
Now, for our final deep dive into specific challenges, let's talk about childhood trauma.
Okay.
You said earlier it can have lasting effects.
It really can.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's important to understand that trauma, it's not something you just get over.
Right.
The effects can last a lifetime.
Wow.
Impacting relationships, mental health, everything.
How can trauma show up in kids?
The book explores different types of trauma.
Okay.
Physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, exposure to violence.
Those are all so heavy.
They are.
Yeah.
Each one can have a different impact, but some common consequences include things like PTSD, anxiety, depression, difficulty regulating emotions.
It's hard to even think about.
It is.
The long-term consequences of those experiences.
Yeah, and it's not just psychological. Trauma can actually change a child's developing brain.
On a physical level.
Yeah, especially areas involved in emotions, stress response, memory.
Wow.
It can make it harder for them to manage stress, control impulses, form healthy attachments.
So how do professionals even approach treatment?
Yeah.
With kids who've experienced trauma?
It requires a specialized approach.
Okay.
The book emphasizes a trauma-informed approach.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means being sensitive to their experiences, avoiding anything that could re-traumatize them.
Right, so creating a safe space.
Exactly, where they feel heard and understood.
Okay.
And treatment often involves different therapies.
Okay.
Trauma-focused CBT, play therapy, family therapy.
Right.
The goal is to help them process their trauma, develop coping skills, and build resilience.
It sounds like working with these kids requires a lot of expertise and compassion.
It does.
Yeah.
It's so important to provide them with the support they need to heal and thrive.
Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about attachment theory.
Oh, interesting.
I've heard about it with relationships.
Yeah.
But how does it apply to child development?
It's all about how our early relationships shape our emotional development and social skills.
Okay.
It boils down to those early experiences with caregivers.
Right. I've heard about those different attachment styles.
Like secure, anxious, avoidant.
Yeah. How do those patterns even develop?
It starts in infancy.
Okay.
The textbook explains that those attachment styles, they form based on the child's interactions with their caregivers.
So if the caregiver is consistently responsive, attuned to the child's needs, the child develops a secure attachment style.
Exactly. They learn that they can rely on other.
Right.
That the world is a safe place.
And that sets the stage for healthy relationships later on.
It does.
What happens if those early interactions aren't so consistent?
That's when we see insecure attachment styles develop.
Okay.
If the caregiver is inconsistent, unavailable, rejecting, the child might become anxious or avoidant.
And those insecure styles, they can lead to problems later on.
Yeah, in relationships.
Right. With friends, partners, even their own kids.
Exactly. They might have trouble trusting, regulating their emotions.
Wow. So even though it starts in infancy,
the
effects can be long-lasting?
They can.
Is there anything you can do about those insecure patterns later in life?
Absolutely. Therapy can be really helpful.
Okay.
Exploring those early experiences, understanding how they affect your current relationships.
Right.
Learning healthier ways to relate to others.
So even if those early experiences weren't ideal, there's still hope for healing and growth.
There is. And speaking of growth, let's talk about adolescence.
Oh, adolescence.
A time of huge change.
I know.
And often a lot of turmoil.
It's a roller coaster.
Is.
Hormones, social pressures, figuring out who you are.
It's a lot to handle.
So what does the textbook say about this stage?
It highlights all the changes. Biological, cognitive, social. Puberty brings those physical transformations, and the brain is developing so rapidly.
Right.
Especially the parts involved in decision-making, impulse control, social cognition.
So it's like their whole world is changing.
Yeah, inside and out.
And the book stresses how important it is to understand this.
Absolutely.
When we're assessing and treating teenagers.
What might look like a disorder in an adult could be totally normal for a teenager.
So we've got to be careful not to over-pathologize.
Exactly.
Every mood swing or rebellious act.
It's about finding that balance.
Right.
Knowing what's typical and when there's a real concern.
Now, what are some of the challenges that are common during adolescence?
The book talks about depression, anxiety, substance abuse.
Yeah, those can be tough at any age.
They are, but teenagers are dealing with so much. It can be overwhelming.
So how is therapy different with teenagers? Compared to younger kids?
Teenagers, they need to feel respected. Understood, empowered.
Right, they're not little kids anymore.
Exactly. They have their own opinions.
Yeah.
The therapist needs to be authentic, non-judgmental.
Okay.
Good at building rapport.
So meeting them where they are.
Yeah.
Creating a space where they feel safe to open up.
And the book also talks about involving parents and families.
Okay.
But also respecting the teenager's privacy.
Right, that's a balance.
It is. But it's so important for creating a supportive environment.
Recognizing their independence while still providing support and guidance.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about gender identity and sexual orientation.
Okay.
I know these can be sensitive topics.
They are.
How does the book approach these?
With a lot of sensitivity.
Okay.
It emphasizes a non-judgmental and affirming approach.
So respecting the individual's experiences and identities.
Exactly, regardless of our own beliefs.
Right.
The book provides guidance on assessing for gender dysphoria.
Okay.
Supporting teens who are questioning their identity. Working with families to create a safe and accepting environment.
It's about creating a space for exploration.
Yeah, without judgment.
I bet there's a lot of misinformation out there about these topics.
Oh, there is.
So it's good to have accurate and compassionate info.
Absolutely.
And mental health professionals, they need to stay up to date.
On the latest research, for sure.
Now let's talk about kids in foster care and adoption.
Okay.
They often face unique challenges.
They do.
They've experienced so much trauma and loss.
Yeah, it can have a profound impact.
How does that affect the development?
The book emphasizes a trauma-informed approach.
Right.
Recognizing that these kids might have attachment issues, behavioral challenges, trouble trusting adults.
So need extra support.
Absolutely.
They heal and thrive.
It's about creating safety and stability.
Okay.
Helping them process what they've been through.
Now let's get into something that can be really tough for parents.
Okay.
Disruptive behavior disorders.
Those can be challenging.
What are some of the key things to understand about them?
Well, they involve these patterns of aggressive, defiant, rule-breaking behavior.
Okay.
Like ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, and conduct disorder, CD.
And those behaviors, they can be really frustrating.
So everyone involved, yeah.
So we're not just talking about typical kid stuff.
Yeah. These patterns, they're persistent.
Okay.
They can really get in the way of a child's life.
At school, at home?
Everywhere, yeah.
So what causes these disorders?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing.
Okay.
It's a mix of things.
Like what?
Genes, biology, environment, social factors.
It's complex.
It is.
So it's not about blaming parents.
No.
But understanding that these behaviors come from a bunch of different influences.
Exactly. And the textbook emphasizes a comprehensive assessment.
Okay.
To figure out what's really going on.
So interviews, observations.
Yeah, maybe even psychological testing.
Wow.
To understand the whole child.
Not just the behavior.
Great. And once we understand the causes,
yeah,
we can start thinking about treatment.
Okay, so what does that look like?
The book highlights a few things.
Okay.
Parent training programs, behavioral therapy, sometimes medication.
So it's about giving both the child and the parents the tools and strategies they need.
Exactly.
And it's not just about reducing those disruptive behaviors.
Right.
It's about teaching kids better ways to express themselves.
Yeah, healthier ways to interact and solve problems.
It's building life skills.
It is.
Now, let's talk about Tourette syndrome.
Okay.
I know it involves tics.
It does.
But can you explain a bit more about what that means?
Sure. Tourette's is a neurodevelopmental disorder.
Okay.
And it's characterized by these involuntary movements and vocalizations.
Okay.
We call those tics.
I've seen those documentaries.
Yeah.
About people with Tourette's who shout out curse words.
Right, right.
Or make those unusual movements.
Those are the more dramatic symptoms.
Yeah.
But they're actually not that common.
Oh.
Coprolalia, that's the involuntary swearing.
Okay.
It only affects a small percentage of people with Tourette's.
So most adjectives are more subtle.
Yeah, things like blinking, throat clearing, shoulder shrugging.
So there's a range of severity.
There is.
What causes Tourette's?
We don't know for sure.
Okay.
But the textbook says it might be related to problems with brain circuits that involve dopamine.
Okay.
That's a neurotransmitter that plays a role in movement and reward.
And there's a genetic component too, right?
There is. It tends to run in families.
So is there a cure?
Not yet.
Okay.
But there are treatments that can help manage the symptoms.
Like what?
Behavioral therapy, medication, and sometimes even deep brain stimulation.
So even though there's no cure,
yeah,
there's hope for improving quality of life.
Absolutely.
Managing those symptoms.
For sure.
Now let's talk about childhood onset schizophrenia.
Oh, wow.
I didn't even realize kids could have schizophrenia.
Yeah, it's usually diagnosed later in adolescence or early adulthood. But in rare cases, it can happen in childhood.
So how is it different from the adult form?
The symptoms are similar.
Okay.
Hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, social withdrawal.
Right.
But in kids, it tends to develop more gradually.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the outlook isn't as good.
Oh, that's hard.
It is. It can be really tough to diagnose and treat.
So how do they treat it?
Usually a combination of things.
Like what?
Antipsychotic meds, therapy, family support.
So it's about managing those symptoms.
Yeah.
Helping the child function better.
And develop coping skills.
Now, I've heard the term mental retardation before.
Yeah.
But I understand that might be outdated. What's the correct way to talk about this?
The preferred term is intellectual disability.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
You're welcome.
What are some important things to know about intellectual disability?
Well, it means having limitations in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior.
So it's not just about IQ scores.
Right. It's about how well someone can function in everyday life.
And the severity varies, right?
It does, from mild to profound.
Depending on the level of support they need.
Exactly.
What causes intellectual disability?
It could be a lot of things.
Like what?
Genetic disorders, problems during pregnancy, infections, environmental factors.
That's complicated.
It can be, yeah.
And how do you address it?
Early intervention is key.
Okay.
And a team approach is important.
Okay.
Special ed, speech therapy, occupational therapy, family support.
It really does take a village.
It does.
To provide the right support.
And help them reach their potential.
Okay, now let's talk about something I know can be stressful for parents.
Oh, what's that?
Sleep disorders in kids.
Oh, I can only imagine.
I know firsthand how lack of sleep can affect everyone.
Yeah, sleep is so important.
Especially for growing kids.
It is.
So what are some common sleep disorders in kids?
The book talks about insomnia, nightmares, sleepwalking, sleep terrors.
Okay, and what causes these disorders?
Could be a lot of things.
Okay.
Medical conditions, stress, anxiety, even learned behaviors.
So it's not always a sign that something's wrong with the child.
Not necessarily.
It could be their environment.
Or their experiences, yeah.
So we have to look at the whole picture.
We do. And the book talks about how to assess for sleep disorders.
Okay.
How to create a healthy sleep environment, how to use behavioral strategies to improve sleep hygiene.
It's good to know there are things you can do.
There are.
Sleep is so important.
It is.
So it's good to address these issues.
Definitely.
Now, let's talk about loss and grief.
Okay.
It's a part of life, but it's got to be so hard for kids to deal with the death of a loved one.
Yeah, they don't always have the words to express what they're feeling.
And they might express it differently than adults.
They do.
So what can we do to help them?
The book talks about understanding the stages of grief.
Okay.
Recognizing how kids show their grief. Providing support that's right for their age.
So meeting them where they are?
Exactly.
Being sensitive to their needs.
It's about creating a safe space for them to share their feelings, answering their questions honestly, helping them find ways to remember their loved ones.
It's about helping them cope.
Yeah.
Now, divorce, that's another tough one.
It is.
How does that impact kids?
Divorce can be so disruptive.
Yeah.
It shakes their sense of security, stability.
Their whole world changes.
It does.
I imagine it's confusing.
Yeah.
Emotionally turbulent.
Especially if there's conflict between the parents.
So what can parents do to help?
The book talks about minimizing conflict.
Okay.
Keeping routines as consistent as possible.
Okay.
Giving kids clear and honest information.
So open communication is key.
It is.
Even when it's hard.
And it's important to remember, kids often blame themselves for divorce.
Oh, wow.
So we need to reassure them that it's not their fault.
Okay.
And help them adjust to the new family structure.
Now, this is a really difficult topic.
Yeah.
But so important to talk about child sexual abuse.
It's a horrifying reality.
It is.
And it's crucial that we understand how to help.
How does the textbook approach this sensitive topic?
It gives guidance on recognizing the signs of abuse, how to interview a child without causing more trauma, and how to work with kids who've been abused to help them heal.
It sounds like this requires very specific skills.
It does. The book emphasizes a team approach involving law enforcement, child protective services, medical professionals, mental health providers.
So many people.
It takes a coordinated effort to provide support and protection.
Now let's talk about something that might seem kind of dry, but it's actually really important.
Okay, what's that?
The intersection of child psychiatry and the law.
Oh, interesting.
What are some key issues that come up there?
It's about how mental health services are provided to kids and teens.
Okay.
We're talking about consent, for treatment, confidentiality.
The psychiatrist's role in legal cases.
It sounds complicated.
It can be, yeah.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive, and there's one more area I want to explore, neuropsychological assessment. What is that all about?
Well, it might sound a bit intimidating, but it's really about understanding the connection between the brain behavior and learning, how a child's brain works, how different cognitive functions develop, and how all of that relates to their actions and their ability to learn.
So you're connecting the inner workings of the brain to what we see on the outside.
Exactly. And that's where a child neuropsychologist comes in. They use a variety of methods, including clinical interviews, behavioral observations, and specialized tests to assess a child's cognitive strengths and weaknesses, kind of like taking inventory of their mental toolkit.
Okay, so let's talk about those tests. What kind of things are they measuring?
We're looking at a wide range of cognitive abilities, things like attention, memory, language, visual, spatial skills, and those executive functions.
Hold on, executive functions. What are those exactly? Those are really important. Think of them as the brain's control center. They involve things like planning organization, problem solving, impulse control, and flexible thinking, all the skills that help us navigate the world effectively.
Wow, those are some pretty high-level skills.
Yeah.
How do you even assess those in children?
It's a bit like piecing together a puzzle. We use a combination of standardized tests, observations of the child's behavior, and even interviews with parents and teachers to get a full picture of how these functions are developing.
And what happens if you find that a child is struggling in one of these areas?
Well, that's where intervention comes in. The neuropsychologist can develop specific strategies to strengthen those weaker areas. It could involve things like cognitive exercises to train those mental muscles, behavioral therapy to address any emotional or behavioral challenges, or even working with the school to create a more supportive learning environment.
So it's like you're giving the child a roadmap to help them develop those skills.
That's a great analogy, and it's important to remember that assessment is an ongoing process as children grow and develop, their needs change, so we need to reassess periodically and adjust our approach accordingly.
Okay, now let's talk about traumatic brain injury, or TBI. How common is that in children?
TBI is more common than you might think it can happen, from falls, car accidents, sports injuries, any event that causes a blow to the head, and the effects can vary widely depending on the severity of the injury and what part of the brain was affected.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of injury?
No, not at all. Some children might experience only mild temporary symptoms like headaches or dizziness, while others could have more long-term cognitive, behavioral, or emotional challenges.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
How does neuropsychological assessment help in these cases?
It helps us figure out exactly which areas of the brain have been affected by the injury, and that allows us to create very specific interventions to address the child's unique needs. For example, we might use cognitive rehabilitation to help rebuild damaged pathways in the brain, speech therapy to address language difficulties, occupational therapy to improve motor skills, and psychological counseling to help the child cope with the emotional impact of the injury. It really takes a team effort.
It sounds like TBI can have a huge impact on a child's life.
It can be a very difficult experience, but the good news is that with early intervention and the right support, many children can make significant recoveries and go on to live full and meaningful lives.
Okay, that's good to hear. What about epilepsy? I know it's a neurological disorder that causes seizures, but how does it affect a child's cognitive abilities?
The connection between epilepsy and cognitive function is complex. It really depends on a lot of factors like the type of seizures, how often they occur, how severe they are, and even the medications used to manage the condition.
So like with TBI, there's no single answer when it comes to epilepsy.
Right. Some children with epilepsy might not have any noticeable cognitive problems at all, while others might struggle with attention, memory, language, or those executive functions we talked about earlier.
I see. So how does neuropsychological assessment help in these cases?
It helps us create a detailed map of the child's cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and this allows us to monitor their progress over time and recommend the most effective educational and therapeutic interventions. It's all about helping them reach their full potential.
This is all so fascinating. It really highlights how important neuropsychological assessment is. It's like we're decoding the mysteries of the brain.
Exactly, and it's crucial for making sure that children get the right support to thrive no matter what challenges they may face.
Okay, now let's talk about chronic pain. I can imagine how difficult it must be for a child to experience ongoing pain and for their families who want to help.
You're right. Chronic pain in children is often complex and challenging to manage. It's not always easy to figure out what's causing the pain, and typical medical treatments don't always work.
So it's not just about giving them medication to mask the pain.
No, the textbook stresses the importance of a multidisciplinary approach. That means involving doctors to address any underlying medical conditions, psychologists to help the child cope with the emotional and psychological aspects of pain, and physical therapists to improve their movement and function.
So you're looking at the whole child, not just the physical symptoms.
Exactly. And understanding the psychological component is so important. We need to consider how the child's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors might be influencing their pain experience.
So it's not that the pain is all in their head, but their mental state can affect how they experience and cope with it.
Exactly. And the textbook offers some guidance on how to assess those psychological factors. We might look at things like anxiety, depression, or even past trauma that could be contributing to the pain.
What about treatment? What kind of psychological approaches can help?
There are some effective options out there. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, can be really helpful in teaching children how to change their thinking patterns about pain and develop coping skills. Relaxation techniques like deep breathing or mindfulness can also reduce stress and pain, and biofeedback can be useful too. It teaches children how to control their physiological responses, which can also help with pain management.
It's good to know that there are things that can help children feel more in control of their pain and improve their overall well-being.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important area, body image concerns. We know that children are bombarded with messages about how they should look, and it's having a real impact on their mental health.
It's so sad to think about children struggling with these issues at such a young age.
It is. The textbook talks about the increase in body image concerns and eating disorders among young people and stresses the importance of early intervention, promoting positive body image, and addressing any underlying mental health concerns.
It's about shifting the focus away from appearance and onto health and well-being.
Exactly. We need to teach children to value themselves for who they are, not what they look like.
Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with me. I feel like I've learned so much.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure. And remember, everyone has a role to play in supporting the well-being of children and adolescents. So let's continue to learn to advocate and to create a world where they can thrive.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into child and adolescent psychiatry. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.